myself like to thank and introduce distinguished broadcaster and historian John Bowman, to whose dulcet tones I awake gradually every Sunday morning, and we're very grateful to you for that too, John. Thank you very much.
So let me first of all introduce Sheila Killian, who's very widely published in this particular field, and she'll be talking about the big picture of the this issue, creating a fair system on taxation. What can be done?
What is a fair corporate tax system? What's fairness in terms of corporate taxes? We tend to think of fairness in, and I'm going to zip through this a little bit, but we can discuss it afterwards. We think of fairness in terms of a bigger slice of the pie. Are we paying too much tax? Are companies paying too little tax? And in general, it's true that the tax rate that has been applied to companies is falling in OECD countries. There is what's known as the race to the bottom. You can see over time is the average tax rate, the headline rate of OECD countries, plunging down towards the x-axis, which the more observant of you will see is set at 25%, which would be an appallingly high tax rate by Irish standards, but this is almost a floor as far as OECD countries are concerned. Apart from the falling headline rates, you also have falling revenue as a percentage of GDP. That it has generally fallen over time. In Ireland, the picture looks a little like this, as corporate tax take as a percentage of GDP. Again, this isn't a great measure in Ireland's case because our GDP is strange, in the interest of diplomacy. It's somewhat inflated by other things. The reasons that other people think there is unfairness in the tax, the thing that motivates the OECD, and I'll come back to this a little bit briefly later, is that the ability of large companies to reduce their taxes, and again Jim will talk more about specifics, comes largely because they have presences in many countries, and they can, because of the prices at which they sell to each other, by setting transfer prices aggressively, they can shift income from high tax to low tax, and in the case of a double Irish, onto no tax jurisdictions, and thereby reduce their overall tax burden. Even that language is kind of interesting. That's coming from my background as I trained as a tax consultant. That we are trained, socialised to think of tax as a burden as opposed to a contribution to the society in which we live. Because southern countries, in general, kind of need to gather a bit of corporate taxes. The reason they do is they have a big informal economy, they have a lot of people, individuals who are very poor and outside of the tax net, so gathering income tax is a challenge. Gathering VAT and sales taxes is an even bigger challenge, and some of the large bodies like the IMF and World Bank are encouraging them strongly to get rid of tariffs and border taxes, so they're left with trying to gather taxes from companies. As long as in the north the tax rate is plummeting down and there is a system of shifting profit north to low tax jurisdictions, that becomes very difficult for them. That's not an academic argument. In countries like Zambia, where you've 1 in 4 kids who are stunted due to malnutrition, it becomes fairly serious to look at the Ireland-Zambia tax treaty. That's not just something academic, that's children's lives they're talking about. So there's unfairness in the system. The question is, are we talking about a few bad apples, pun intended? Are there any kind of big alternatives? And there are some big alternatives that are being considered. On the right, you have certain North American think tanks and also Oxford, who think, well, gee, these companies are hard to tax, let's not bother. Let's just let the profits flow through. When they're paid out to the shareholders, they can be taxed. So, don't bother. There are many things wrong with that. I could be here all day. Countries operate in a particular economy, they should pay taxes to that economy. On the other end of the scale, you have the Tax Justice Network, who think there should be a unitary tax. And a unitary tax means, okay, you've got a multinational, they're shifting their profit around between countries, let's forget all that messing, and let's just tax them on their worldwide income. And then we'll worry about how you apportion that tax among all the different countries that they operate in. This is something that is being resisted somewhat by the OECD. Some bodies feel corporate taxes are hard to collect. Sales taxes like VAT are easy to collect. They are easy to collect in developed economies. They're kind of invisible. We don't notice it when we're buying things. We don't notice we're paying tax all the time. Also, homeless people, students, poor people, everybody, you can collect sales tax from them. So they're not very nice taxes, but they're politically expedient. And then you have transaction taxes like the Tobin tax that are sometimes suggested as an alternative to corporate taxes. If you think about what's happening over the next 3.5 years, if you like, this is going to be the big one. The OECD base erosion profit shifting is, there are plans to consolidate tax treaties, to obviously prevent stateless countries, to consolidate the way in which one country recognises another. So for example, in the double Irish you essentially have a Bermudan company hiding behind an Irish company. Companies and countries engaging in a period of spontaneous reform over the next few years. In fact, we've seen a little bit of that lately, not too far from here. Because it's kind of like when news is released to the market and the price adjusts. If everyone thinks Twitter is going to be an amazing IPO, then the price is, that's built into the IPO. The anticipation effect is built in. When people know that these rules are changing, they'll step before they're pushed. So, for instance, we've had a change in our tax law lately about the abolition of stateless companies. Some countries, which are kind of maybe known as conduit countries, through which a lot of money flows, may get a smaller slice of this pool of corporate tax. That may be a smaller slice of a bigger pie, if you like. That's kind of the optimistic story. And whether or not it's a bigger pie or just the same pie rolled a bit thinner, we'll have to see. It depends on how base erosion profit shifting works out. It depends on whether companies are actually paying more tax or not. But over the next 3 to 5 years, there will be some very interesting developments coming from quite unlikely sources. And you can already see the language is changing. People are talking differently about corporate tax reform. People you would never have expected to are suddenly talking in terms of a moral argument.
A number of countries play a central role in how capital is flowing from one country, from one market segment, from one actor to the other. And these countries are in the European continent, Ireland, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. And so the types of problems they pose by doing this is different from what we see in tax avoidance. So it's not about societies losing out because there's a smaller share of the collective burden being carried by the largest shoulders. But this fundamentally has to do with creating an unsafe international financial system. This fundamentally has to do with how the sovereignty of states is being eroded, and the capacity of nation states to govern their financial system is being eroded because this shadow banking basically is about regulatory arbitrage. It is about getting across rules set by nation states. And so this is quite a fundamental issue, and we believe this element, although it is, I must admit, it is complex and vague, we must take this on board in discussing tax havens because it's completely intertwined with it. What we need to find is ways to discuss this in all of the different countries that are pivotal, like Ireland, like the Netherlands, to understand its role, and also to understand the costs you are creating, and my country is creating for other countries, and the moral issues involved with this. And finally, I think that underlying these offshore financial centers, their ability to create these loopholes is this ongoing competition between these locations. And so in the end, I think that only on a larger scale, like on the European Union, or even bigger, but on the European Union would be a good start, only at that scale, political scale, I think that we can start, if we start harmonizing parts, then you can really start to see effects. Because otherwise, it will only be patchwork that creates that will always create possibilities to create loopholes to very smart planners and lawyers.
So my talk is, actually I get this to work, on Ireland, is it a tax haven? There's much media and other comments to the effect that Ireland is a tax haven. Government ministers, the IDA and others have stated categorically that Ireland is not a tax haven. And recently Martin Sullivan, a US tax expert, commented in a Forbes magazine article, it's a well-known business publication in the US. He says, if Ireland wants to continue to attract investment by the world's most respected companies, it desperately needs to avoid the tax haven label. It must also avoid incurring the wrath of the citizenry of the European Union, with Ireland to stop using low tax rates to steal jobs and investment from other countries. Because on to comment, we all understand perfectly well why the Irish will never accept their country being called a tax haven. But we cannot use that label. We must have a term for a country with extremely generous tax rules allowed to attract enormous amounts of foreign capital. He says. It's not a tax haven. Let's say Ireland is a big L. The comment from Forbes has been replicated in Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. These are not radical newspapers. These are the kind of newspapers and media outlets that we would generally expect to support multinational companies, to be opposed to taxation. So it is, I think, we need to sit up and pay attention when large international media organisations are describing Ireland as a tax haven, never mind politicians in other countries. So, is Ireland a tax haven? Well, on one level, it's very easy to prove that Ireland is not a tax haven. Reach into your back pocket and produce a monthly pay slip. And if you look at that, you'll see in my case that on average 40% of my pay goes in tax deductions to the state in one form or another. So, as far as I'm concerned, Ireland is not a tax haven. But nevertheless, for many purposes, and for corporate purposes, Ireland has features of a tax haven. And these features are, of course, we have well known, low corporate tax rates, ease of incorporation, a tax regime that is very responsive to the taxation requirements of MNCs, and relatively light touch regulation. I would argue that it's not our corporate tax rate is the key thing. It's a very flexible response to the multinational companies' needs. Features of internet-based firms, such as ambiguities in relation to location of sales and assets, enable these firms to use tax strategies which result in extremely low rates of corporation tax. Firms which are largely internet-based and firms which are intellectually property-intensive, for example software firms, are sometimes referred to as new economy firms. And this has considerable implications for tax systems, because there can be an increasing divergence between the location of new economy type activities and the location of customers and sources of revenue. This means that the principle of taxing profits where there's residence defined as permanent establishment becomes ambiguous. I might just comment on the recent OECD said we're going to do something about this. But why is the definition of permanent tax residence so difficult and so vague? If you have a shoebox over in the corner as regards the international tax treaties, that's where you're permanently resident. It's because of the OECD. They're the ones who agreed to these very wide definitions of a permanent residence. So having created the problem, and we have to remember that the OECD is made up of members and it doesn't have formal legal powers, it's a consensus-based approach. They have very wide definitions of permanent establishment because of OECD rules. So issues also arise into this source of value added and whatever. The issues are complex, so what I want to try to do is I want to deal with 3 case studies: Google, Apple and Ryanair, and I want to show you the effects of the Irish corporate tax regime on their tax payments. So we just deal with Google, Apple and Ryanair. I'm going to look at some of their accounts because their accounts are available, and it's very easy to get all sorts of stuff saying we're not a tax haven. Let's just look at some data and we can see what are the effects. So the first point is that evidence presented to the UK Public Accounts Committee showed that Google had substantial operations in the UK, employing 1,500 and generated 18 billion in sales in the period 2006 to 2011. Yet just 16 million was paid in UK corporation tax in this period. And the PAC, the UK, concluded Google defends its tax position by claiming that its sales of advertising space to UK clients take place in Ireland, an argument which we find deeply unconvincing on the basis of evidence that despite sales being billed from Ireland, most sales revenue is generated by staff in the UK. It's quite clear to us that sales to UK clients are the primary purpose, responsibility and result of its UK operation, that the processing of sales to Google Ireland has no purpose other than to avoid UK corporation tax. Now, France and Germany and other countries have other issues. We might remember that companies, MNCs operating in Ireland, operate what they call an EMEA structure. Stands for Europe, Middle East and Africa. African countries suffer enormously because of these tax strategies. A Google subsidiary in Ireland, Google Ireland, accounts for 92% of Google sales outside Ireland. Google Ireland sales amounted to 15 billion and 12 million respectively for 2012-11. Google Ireland reported a pre-tax profit of 153 million for 2012, 24 million for 2011. However, this pre-tax profit was after deducting something called administrative payments, which is mostly royalty payments, of 10 billion and 9 billion. If these had not been the deduction, pre-tax profits would be much higher. These payments are likely to be royalty payments paid to its parent company, Google Ireland Holdings. Google Ireland Holdings is an unlimited company. We don't know anything about it. It's an unlimited company, registered in Ireland, but unlimited. It's also a company, what I call is bilocated. But for tax purposes, for corporate tax purposes, it's in Bermuda. Now, there's a recent stage in the budget, and the minister made a statement, change in the budget, announced a change in the budget to say so that we no longer allow stateless company. Google and these other companies are not stateless. They're registered in Ireland. They're legally resident in Ireland. For corporate tax purposes, they're in Bermuda or Cayman Islands or whatever, but they are not stateless. The address of Google, in fact, is given as Clarendon House, Church Street, Bermuda. So you just look at the profits of Google, and there's the point I made. You see the administrative expenses, 10.9 billion. These aren't explained at all, but they're likely to be royalty payments paid to Bermuda. And this is where our friends in the Netherlands come in, because Google used to transfer these profits to the Netherlands because there was a withholding tax and royalty payments from Ireland. So they went from the Netherlands to Bermuda. It's called the Dutch sandwich. If you're bilocated, it's called the double Irish. But it's really, I think, simpler to think of as bilocated. Now, foreign withholding tax is 17.4 million, so you're not even sure the tax shown in their accounts. It's received by the Irish Exchequer. In fact, it's the tax charge, might not actually be the tax payments. So the effective tax rate from their accounts is 21.86%. If you ignore the royalty payment, is 0.3%. Effective tax rates are determined by the definition of administrative expenses. What are these administrative expenses? So what are the implications? Well, Google in its SEC filings, it states, although we file US federal, US state and foreign tax returns, our two major tax jurisdictions are the US and Ireland. Substantially all of the income from foreign operations is earned by our Irish subsidiary. So the Irish subsidiary is Google outside the US. So let's deal with the next case study. The US Senate report on Apple Computer Permanent Subcommittee investigations found one subsidiary located in Ireland, Apple Sales International, had no employees but had income of 22 billion in 2011 and paid 10 million in tax. This is Apple Sales International located in Cork. This compares with income before tax of the group as a whole of 108 billion in 2011, tax payments shown at about 14 billion or whatever. The corporate taxation rate in Ireland for bilocated companies is irrelevant. The corporate tax rate in Ireland could be 100%. If you're paying your tax in Bermuda or Cayman Islands, it doesn't matter, because that's the tax rate. The Bermuda or Cayman Islands tax rate is the appropriate one. Tax reduction strategies are common in old economy firms as well as new economy firms. These developments have considerable adverse implications for the corporate tax base in Ireland and elsewhere, as well as for other taxes such as PRSI and VAT.
Christian Aid has conducted research to show that every year $160 billion is lost to the poorest countries in the world through transfer mispricing between related companies. And that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. That could be revenue that could be spent on basic services, essential services and infrastructure and things in developing countries. It also prolongs countries' reliance on aid and leaves them dependent on donors and skews accountability away from citizens and towards multinational companies and to donors, which is a situation that is certainly in the development sector is one that we want to get away from. But really, numbers, it's not really about the numbers. I think what we can all agree on, and certainly the OECD would support this and take this line, is that developing countries are losing more to tax avoidance than they're receiving in aid. So for that reason alone, in terms of efficiency of our aid money that we're providing to developing countries in our aid cooperation, that's a question of aid effectiveness as much as anything else. To get to the meat of it, is Ireland complicit in this? I think the answer is yes. There are two pieces of research that have been conducted over the last few years that would show that. In 2008, Christian Aid conducted research, carried out a report called False Profits. It showed that between 2005 and 2007, 5.8 billion worth of capital flowed into Ireland from the same kind of transfer mispricing that I refer to. That's just inflating or deflating the price of a traded commodity between related companies to either minimise profit in a certain location or maximise it in a certain location. Of that, 268 million came from the poorest 49 countries in the world. It is an international issue, and there are elements of the international financial architecture that obviously need to be done, addressed at an international level. However, the responses that we get and listen to in the media, which is that Ireland that the issue is an international issue, I think is an abdication of responsibility on the part of the Irish government. As I've shown, there are very key things that Ireland can do unilaterally and in its own right to demonstrate, as they so often say, that they are champions of transparency and exponents of the highest standards of transparency and disclosure. So, thank you very much.